thanks so much for joining me here today. Today we're beginning a verse-by-verse study of one of the most influential books in all of history. The ideas you're going to learn here in the book of Romans are the very same ideas that gave Martin Luther the conviction to stand up to the most powerful institution at the time, the Catholic Church. It's the same ideas that turned John Wesley from a very timid person into one of the most powerful preachers that ever lived, and on and on and on. It is a powerful, powerful book. It's the same ideas that's been impacting my life ever since I began to study this book. And I'm so excited to be going through this book with you. Today, we're going to start by giving a little background into the author and also looking at verse 1. And I would encourage you to have your Bible so you can follow along and also something to take some notes. So let's jump in. The book of Romans was written by the Apostle Paul in about 57 AD. But what you need to know about Paul is that when he first makes his appearance in the Bible, he is a completely different man than the Paul that you're familiar with. First of all, his name is not Paul, it's Saul of Tarsus. And he's not a Christian. In fact, he's a rabbi. He's a very educated man, a very religious man, and a very, very proud man. And he is no friend to the Christians. In fact, he is a fierce enemy of the Christians. And he is doing everything in his power to destroy them, actually. He had heard about these disciples of Jesus, uneducated fishermen, and they were claiming that their rabbi, who claims to be God, that he had risen from the dead. And Saul thought that this was the height of blasphemy. And a lot of Jews, they were buying into this. And so it was very, very dangerous. It was a very dangerous movement in Saul's mind. And so Saul made it his life's mission to wipe this Jesus movement from the face of the earth. He hunted down Christians everywhere he could find them, men, women, teenagers. He went looking for them everywhere, even into other cities. And he drugged them back in chains. And Saul was even responsible for the deaths of some. In fact, it was Saul who was the one who was holding the coats of the men who were stoning Stephen, who was the first martyr. And it was Saul who was holding their coats, nodding his approval that, yes, this is a good thing. Well, Saul was on his way to Damascus to go hunt down some more of these Jesus people. And he was literally stopped in his tracks. Have you ever had God stop you in your tracks? Well, he was. And he saw a blinding light, and he fell off his horse, and he heard a voice that said, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And Saul asked, "Who are you, Lord?" And the answer came back, and it was the shock of a lifetime. The voice said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. I am the one that you've been trying to destroy. I am that man." And I can only imagine what a crushing revelation that had to be. Think about how humiliating that would have been for Saul. I mean, the great teacher, the learned rabbi, the man of God. And here he was, face to face with the God that he claimed to serve, the God that he claimed to love. And here was God telling him, "You have actually been my enemy all this time. You've been killing my people. You have blood on your hands." And I've got to imagine that Saul's whole world came tumbling down at that moment. If there was ever a man in history who really needed the grace of God, it was Saul of Tarsus. And it's this man who writes the words that we're about to read. In verse 1, he says, "Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated to the gospel of God." Now, the first thing that jumps out is that Saul, he's changed his name, hasn't he? He's gone from Saul to Paul, and Paul actually means little. Paul is introducing himself to the Christians here in Rome, and he starts by saying, look, I am no longer the Saul that you remember. Just like some of you who are watching, you're no longer the same people that people used to know. You see, the name Saul, it had connotations of importance and somebody who was great. It literally means the requested one. That was who Saul used to be. Proud, arrogant, trying to be somebody, trying to prove something, pulling himself up by his own bootstraps. But God cut his bootstraps. And Paul says this. He says, look, I am the little one. That's what Paul means. It means little. And Paul said, don't be impressed with anything about who I am. Let me introduce myself to you. And there are 3 things that you need to know about me. He says, number 1, I'm a bondservant of Christ. I'm owned by God. Number 2, I am called by God. And number 3, I'm separated to the gospel. Notice really carefully here what you don't see is anything about Paul's accomplishments. He doesn't say, hey, I'm Paul, the one who founded all these churches, the most effective evangelist that's ever lived. How does Paul describe himself? He said, first of all, I'm the little one, and the only reason I'm here is because God had mercy on me. And I'm no longer that guy that you used to know. The guy who was so proud of the kind of man that he was. That is not me anymore. Because once upon a time, I came face to face with the kind of man I was, and I found out exactly the kind of man that I was. And that realization was pretty crushing. But God had mercy on me. And not only did He rescue me from myself, but He called me in the ministry. And that's what I want to tell you about me, that my whole life is saturated in grace. Do you know that if you're a Christian, then your whole life is saturated in grace? Isn't that amazing news? And Paul says, I'm a bondservant of Christ. In other words, I'm owned by God. Now, maybe that sounds a little weird. How is it that we came to be owned by God? Well, first of all, we are owned by God because He created us. It's like when Bruno Mars writes a song, that song is his property. If you create a piece of art, then that art belongs to you. It's intellectual property. So think about it. If God really did create you, if that's true, then you belong to God. So we belong to God by virtue of creation, number 1. Secondly, God came to earth and He purchased us again with His own blood. 1 Peter says this, knowing that you were not redeemed or bought with corruptible things like silver or gold from your aimless conduct received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. When Jesus died, what was He doing? He was buying us back. He was purchasing our salvation. So we belong to God by virtue of Christ's own blood, which means that you are twice bought. You are doubly owned. And so the next time you start feeling like you're alone or like God's left you to fend for yourself, and we feel like that sometimes, just remember something, that I am twice bought. I belong to God. In fact, that's where my whole identity comes from. And Paul says that he is called and separated by Jesus. And we'll talk about that more as we go. The point is that he wasn't called when he was deserving, when he was at his best. God called him when he was at his worst. Just like God called some of us, not when we were at our best, but when we were at our worst. When we were so ashamed that we could barely look Him in the face. That is when God demonstrates His own love towards us It says later, "In that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." Our lives are saturated in grace, and that is the best news in the world. Tomorrow, we're going to continue with Paul's introduction to the Romans, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you then.